March 11th, 1241. The Hungarian village of Mohi, nestled along the Sajo River. A farmer named Istvan awakens before dawn to find his livestock dead in their pens, not slaughtered but covered in strange pustules, their bodies rigid with fever. Above his barn, 3 golden eagles circle in patterns no wild bird would fly. Leather jesses still attached to their legs, small cloth pouches dangling from their talons. Within 5 days, every soul in Mohi would be dead or dying. Within 2 weeks, the pustules would spread to nearby villages. And within a month, Hungarian physicians would discover something that defied all understanding. The Mongol Golden Horde, still 30 miles away, had found a way to kill without ever drawing a sword. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about history's most horrifying case of biological warfare, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest chapters of human history. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's step back into 1241 when the Mongol Empire turned nature itself into a weapon of mass death. The year 1240 marked the zenith of Mongol expansion into Europe. Under the command of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the Golden Horde had already devastated Rus's principalities, leaving cities like Kiev burning and depopulated. The Mongol war machine operated with a precision that terrified medieval Europe. Their composite bows could pierce armor at 200 yards, their cavalry could cover 100 miles in a single day, and their psychological warfare was as devastating as their military tactics. Hungary, under King Bela IV, represented the gateway to Western Europe. The kingdom was prosperous, its plains perfect for agriculture and horse breeding, its population swelling toward 2 million souls. The Carpathian Mountains formed a natural fortress, and Hungarian nobles believed their heavily armored knights could repel any eastern invaders. They had heard rumors of Mongol atrocities, entire populations executed, pyramids built from skulls, cities erased from existence, but these seemed like exaggerations meant to frighten children. What the Hungarians didn't know was that the Mongols had been studying them for over a year. Mongol scouts, disguised as merchants and wandering monks, had mapped every road, identified every fortification, and documented Hungarian military capabilities with meticulous detail. But Batu Khan's most valuable intelligence came from defectors and prisoners, who revealed something crucial. European armies had no experience with epidemic disease as a military tactic. The Mongols, however, understood disease intimately. Their expansion across Asia had exposed them to plague, smallpox, and hemorrhagic fevers. They had witnessed how these invisible killers could empty cities more efficiently than siege warfare. And in the winter of 1240, as they prepared to invade Hungary, Mongol commanders began experimenting with a strategy that would combine their legendary skill with falconry and their growing understanding of contagion. In the steppes of Central Asia, falconry wasn't merely sport. It was survival. Mongol warriors could train golden eagles to hunt wolves and foxes, using birds as extensions of their own predatory instincts. These raptors became so bonded to their handlers that they would return from kills miles away, landing on outstretched arms with perfect precision. It was this relationship between man and bird that gave someone in Batu Khan's inner circle a terrible idea. The first documented incident occurred on February 19, 1241, in the border village of Vareka, nestled in the northeastern Carpathian passes. A local priest named Father Gurgely recorded in his parish ledger an unusual occurrence. 3 great birds, eagles of uncommon size, descended upon the village square. They carried not prey but small bundles wrapped in silk. When Janos the blacksmith approached, the birds scattered these bundles and departed eastward. Janos reported the cloth was damp and bore strange markings. By evening, Janos complained of fever. Father Gurgely's entries over the following week trace a pattern that would become sickeningly familiar. Janos developed a rash by the 2nd day. By the 3rd, the rash had transformed into raised pustules filled with fluid. His fever climbed so high he became delirious, calling out for his dead mother, convinced his skin was burning from the inside. On the 5th day, the pustules turned to hard, pearl-like lesions covering his face, hands, and torso. He died on the 7th day, his body so disfigured that his own wife initially refused to identify him. But Janos was merely the first. Within 10 days of the eagle's visit, 17 villagers in Vareka exhibited identical symptoms. The village physician, a man named Tibor who had studied in Vienna, recognized the disease immediately. Variola major, smallpox, What he couldn't explain was the outbreak's origin. Smallpox typically spread through prolonged contact with infected individuals. Vareke had no visitors for weeks. The village was isolated, tucked into a mountain pass that saw little trade traffic in winter. Yet somehow, the disease had appeared simultaneously in multiple households separated by significant distances. "It is as though God's judgment fell from the heavens," Father Gurgley wrote on March 3rd. "The affliction shows no pattern of natural contagion. It strikes the young and old, pious and sinful alike, without mercy or logic." The second incident, far more disturbing, occurred on February 28th near the town of Ungvar, approximately 50 miles southwest of Vareke. A Hungarian military patrol led by Captain Mihaly Horváth encountered something that shattered their understanding of warfare. His officia. Report to King Bela IV's court still exists in the Hungarian National Archives. We observed on the eastern horizon a formation of birds numbering perhaps 20 or more. They flew in coordinated patterns, not as natural flocks fly, but with military precision. As they approached our position, we saw they were raptors, eagles and large hawks, and each bore equipment upon their legs and bodies. They circled our encampment 3 times, then released small objects that fell among our tents. Upon examination, we found bundles of cloth, each sealed with wax and marked with foreign script. My men, curious and foolish, opened several bundles. The cloth within was damp and bore dark stains. It smelled of sickness, a sweet, rotting odor that made our horses nervous. I ordered the bundles burned and our hands washed in wine, but the damage was done. Within 3 days, 5 of my men developed fever and rash. Within a week, 12 men were afflicted. I write this report from quarantine, for I too now bear the marks of this devil's plague. These were not natural birds. They were trained, directed, sent with purpose. The Mongols have found a way to kill us before battle is even joined. Captain Horváth died on March 9th. Of his patrol of 32 men, only 9 survived, and 3 of those were left permanently disfigured, their faces cratered with pox scars so severe they could barely see. What makes these incidents particularly chilling is the specificity of the targeting. The birds didn't drop their deadly cargo randomly. They focused on military camps, fortified positions, and strategic villages along likely invasion routes. Someone was directing these attacks with intelligence and purpose, softening Hungarian defenses with biological weapons before the actual army arrived. Hungarian nobles initially dismissed these reports as panic and superstition. Smallpox outbreaks happen naturally, they argued. The appearance of trained birds was coincidence or exaggeration by frightened soldiers. Even King Bela IV, though concerned, couldn't bring himself to believe the Mongols possessed such capability. Medieval warfare simply didn't work this way. Armies fought with swords, arrows, and siege engines, not with disease-carrying birds. The third incident removed all doubt. On March 8th, a Hungarian scouting force of approximately 200 cavalry encountered Mongol scouts near the Ondava River. The engagement was brief. The Mongols retreated almost immediately, seemingly unprepared for combat. But as the Hungarian forces pursued, they noticed something overhead. Dozens of raptors, clearly trained, circling in holding patterns. Then, at what appeared to be a signal, a blast from a Mongol horn, the birds descended. Lieutenant Andras Szilagyi, one of the few survivors, provided testimony that was recorded by the royal chronicler. The sky darkened with wings. They came upon us like demons, not attacking with talons and beaks as natural birds might, but releasing their burdens with precision. The bundles struck among us, breaking open, releasing cloth that some of my men touched before I could order otherwise. The Mongols watched from a distance, laughing. They made gestures suggesting we were already dead, and God forgive me, they were right. Of the 200 Hungarian cavalry, 147 would contract smallpox. 93 would die. The survivors carried the disease back to their homes, to their families, spreading the infection through Hungarian villages like wildfire through dry grass. Medical scholars estimate that by mid-March 1241, before the main Mongol army had even crossed into Hungary proper, over 2,000 Hungarians had been exposed to smallpox through these deliberate aerial attacks. The full scope of the Mongol Falcon messenger strategy was discovered on March 25, 1241. Under circumstances as accidental as they were horrifying, a Hungarian patrol, operating near the Tisza River and tasked with monitoring Mongol movements, stumbled upon an abandoned Mongol camp. The encampment had been vacated recently, fires still smoldered, and the ground bore fresh hoofprints heading southwest. But what the patrol found among the tents would change medieval warfare forever. Lieutenant Peter Nagy, leading the patrol, described finding what he initially thought was a falconry training area. There were wooden perches arranged in rows, leather hoods and jesses scattered about, and the distinctive mutes, bird droppings, that indicated recent occupation by raptors. But as his men investigated further, they discovered something profoundly disturbing. In a large felt tent, they found detailed records written in Mongolian script. While none of the Hungarian soldiers could read the language, the illustrations were clear enough. Diagrams showed eagles and hawks with special harnesses designed to carry small pouches. Charts tracked flight patterns and distances. Most chilling were the careful drawings of diseased corpses, bodies covered in pustules, alongside sketches of cloth bundles being attached to birds' legs. But the true revelation came when they discovered the preparation area. In a separate tent sealed with heavy felt to contain odors, they found the source material for the biological weapons. Cloth strips, carefully sorted and stored in sealed containers, had been deliberately contaminated with fluids from smallpox victims. The Mongols had collected scabs, pus, and fluid from infected individuals, likely their own soldiers or prisoners who had contracted the disease naturally, and had systematically prepared these materials for weaponization. The process, as later reconstructed by medieval physicians who examined the site, was disturbingly methodical. Fresh cloth would be soaked in the infected materials, then partially dried to preserve the viral particles while keeping the fabric moist enough to remain infectious. The cloth was then sealed in wax-coated leather pouches that the birds' company would carry without being infected themselves. Birds, after all, cannot contract human smallpox. The pouches were designed to break open on impact with the ground, releasing the contaminated cloth where humans would handle it. Even more disturbing were the detailed notes on timing and dispersal patterns. The Mongols had calculated how long smallpox remained viable in different conditions, how far their trained birds could fly before needing to return, and what environmental factors affected disease transmission. This wasn't primitive biological warfare. This was sophisticated, scientifically approached biological weapons development in the 13th century. Lieutenant Nagy made the fatal error of allowing his men to thoroughly search the site before understanding the danger. 7 of his 12 soldiers handled the cloth samples, curious about the strange materials. 3 developed smallpox within the week. 2 died. When the recovered materials and documents reached King Belafort's court in Esztergom, they caused immediate panic. The royal physician, Master Benedek, examined the cloth samples with growing horror. He had studied smallpox extensively during an outbreak in 1238 and understood its devastating contagion. But the idea that it could be deliberately spread, weaponized, and delivered by trained birds was beyond anything in medieval medical understanding. "We face an enemy that wages war not only with sword and arrow," Master Benedek wrote in his report to the king, "but with the very plagues of Egypt. They have captured pestilence itself and taught it to fly. If they can deliver smallpox through birds, what other diseases might they command? How do we defend against an enemy that can kill our people without setting foot in our lands?" The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. Hungarian military commanders suddenly understood why entire border regions had fallen silent before any Mongol troops arrived. Villages weren't being bypassed. They were being systematically infected and left to die. The Mongols weren't avoiding fortifications out of weakness. They were poisoning the defenders with disease before the actual siege began. Intelligence reports from captured Mongol scouts, obtained through interrogation, confirmed the worst fears. The Falcon Messenger Corps was a specialized unit within the Mongol army, comprising handlers who had trained since childhood to work with raptors. They had developed their techniques over years of experimentation, testing different methods of disease, transmission, and bird training. The smallpox campaign against Hungary wasn't improvised. It was the culmination of a long-term biological weapons program. The Mongol invasion of Hungary proceeded with devastating efficiency. On April 11, 1241, at the Battle of Mohi, Batu Khan's forces obliterated the Hungarian army in one of medieval history's most lopsided defeats. But the battle was merely the culmination of a campaign that had already been won through biological warfare. The Hungarian forces, decimated by smallpox outbreaks among their troops and support populations, could barely field a coherent defense. Contemporary chroniclers estimated that between 5,000 and 8,000 Hungarians died from the deliberate smallpox infections in the months before and during the invasion. This number doesn't include secondary infections, The disease spread naturally once introduced, killing thousands more who never encountered the Mongol falcon messengers. Some modern historians suggest the total death toll from the biological warfare campaign may have reached 15 to 20,000, though precise numbers are impossible to determine given medieval record-keeping limitations. The aftermath of the falcon messenger strategy extended far beyond the immediate military campaign. Hungarian society was traumatized not just by military defeat, but by the violation of fundamental assumptions about warfare. Medieval combat had rules, even in its brutal form. Armies met on battlefields, sieges followed established patterns, and civilians, while often suffering, weren't deliberately targeted with disease. The Mongols had shattered these conventions. They had turned nature against humanity, weaponizing the relationship between man and animal, perverting the art of falconry into a delivery system for mass death. Hungarian survivors spoke of the attacks in terms usually reserved for demonic activity. Church records from the period are filled with references to devil's birds and winged demons, reflecting a population trying to comprehend something outside their conceptual framework. King Bela IV, who barely escaped the Mongol invasion with his life, spent the remainder of his reign rebuilding Hungary's defenses. But his military reforms focused almost exclusively on traditional fortifications and cavalry. He had no answer for biological warfare. How does one defend against disease delivered from the sky? Medieval medicine offered no solutions. Quarantine practices were primitive, germ theory wouldn't exist for another 6 centuries, and the concept of deliberate disease transmission was so novel that no defensive strategies existed. The Catholic Church responded with characteristic medieval interpretation. Pope Gregory IX, upon receiving reports of the falcon messenger strategy, declared it a work of Satan, employing the creatures of God for unholy purposes. Several papal bulls were issued condemning the practice as not merely warfare but spiritual corruption. However, these religious condemnations had no practical effect on Mongol military tactics. What's particularly significant is how this knowledge was suppressed in the decades following the invasion. Western European chronicles of the Mongol Wars rarely mentioned the biological warfare aspects, focusing instead on conventional military defeats. There were several reasons for this selective amnesia. First, military commanders were ashamed to admit had been defeated by disease before battles even occurred. Second, the tactic was so unprecedented and terrifying that describing it might cause panic among populations already traumatized by Mongol expansion. Third, and perhaps most cynically, some European military planners began quietly studying the Mongol techniques, curious about their potential application. Evidence of this clandestine research appears in several military treatises from the late 13th century. A French manuscript dated to approximately 1285 titled De Re Militari et Stratagematibus contains a brief cryptic section on the Eastern method of delivering contagion through beasts of the air. The author, whose identity remains unknown, describes theoretical applications while carefully noting that such practices are contrary to Christian warfare and should be documented only for defensive understanding. The Mongol Falcon Messenger Corps itself disappeared from historical record after Batu Khan's death in 1255. The Golden Horde's subsequent campaigns in Eastern Europe employed conventional tactics, suggesting either that the biological warfare program was discontinued or that its practitioners died without passing on their knowledge. Some historians speculate that the Mongols themselves recognized the unpredictable danger of disease weapons. Smallpox doesn't respect military boundaries, and epidemics can spread back to their originators. Hungarian society never fully recovered its pre-invasion population levels. The combination of military losses, disease deaths, and mass displacement left the kingdom weakened for generations. King Bela IV implemented extensive rebuilding programs, including the construction of numerous stone castles and fortified cities. But these defenses were designed against armies, not against biological agents. The trauma of the falcon messengers became embedded in Hungarian folklore. Stories of plague birds persisted for centuries, warning children not to approach large raptors, especially those that seemed unusually tame or bore leather equipment. Even today, elderly Hungarians in rural areas sometimes recall their grandparents' tales of birds that brought death on their wings, folk memories of events 7.5 centuries past. Perhaps most disturbing is what the falcon messenger strategy revealed about human innovation in warfare. The Mongols, facing the challenge of conquering heavily defended territories with limited manpower, had developed a solution of horrifying efficiency. They had observed natural disease transmission, studied the relationship between humans and animals, and synthesized these observations into a weapon system. They had, in essence, practiced scientific method, hypothesis, experimentation, refinement, in the service of biological warfare. Medieval chroniclers who documented the invasion struggled with theological questions raised by this innovation. If God created birds and disease, how could they be combined for such evil purposes? Did this represent human ingenuity or demonic influence? These questions were never satisfactorily answered, but they established a pattern of thought that would resurface centuries later, as humanity developed increasingly sophisticated weapons of mass destruction. The Golden Horde's Falcon messenger strategy represents a pivotal moment in the history of biological warfare. While armies had previously used crude tactics, catapulting plague corpses over walls, poisoning water supplies, the Mongol program demonstrated systematic planned biological weapons development. They had created a reliable delivery system, standardized their infectious materials, and integrated biological weapons into broader military strategy. This wasn't opportunistic use of disease, it was institutionalized biological warfare. The incident's impact on military thinking cannot be overstated, even if that impact was largely invisible. In the centuries following the Mongol invasions, European military theorists occasionally referenced irregular methods of Eastern warfare in their treatises. These oblique mentions suggest that knowledge of biological warfare tactics persisted in military circles, even as public discussion was suppressed. The concept that disease could be deliberately weaponized and delivered never completely disappeared from military consciousness. The legal and ethical frameworks that would eventually govern biological weapons, frameworks still developing in our own time, have roots in medieval responses to the Mongol tactics. The fundamental question raised in 1241 remains relevant today. Where is the boundary between legitimate military innovation and weapons too horrible to employ? The Mongols answered that question differently than medieval Christians, and different societies continue to disagree on the answer. Modern historians studying the Mongol biological warfare program have noted disturbing parallels to 20th century weapons development. The systematic approach, the testing and refinement of delivery mechanisms, the careful documentation of results, these methodologies would be recognizable to scientists in Japan's Unit 731 or Cold War biological weapons laboratories. The scale and technology changed dramatically, but the fundamental logic remained constant. Disease could be controlled, directed, and used to kill enemies more efficiently than conventional weapons. The Falcon messenger incident also reveals something profound about technological innovation under pressure. The Mongols faced a genuine military problem. Hungarian defenses were formidable, and traditional siege warfare would be costly and time-consuming. They needed a force multiplier, a way to degrade enemy capabilities before battle was joined. Their solution was creative. Drawing on their cultural expertise with falconry and their experiential knowledge of epidemic disease. That this innovation was morally horrifying didn't prevent its development. Military necessity rarely What happened to the specific practitioners of Falcon messenger biological warfare remains unknown. Were they honored as military innovators within Mongol culture, or did they become pariahs, shunned for using methods that disturbed even their own people? Mongol records from this period are fragmentary at best, and the empire had more pressing concerns as it fragmented after Ogedei Khan's death in 1241. The biological warfare specialists likely dispersed, their knowledge dying with them or being deliberately suppressed. One tantalizing possibility suggested by some historians but impossible to verify is that the technique spread beyond the Mongols. The Ottoman Empire, which would later incorporate many former Mongol territories and military traditions, occasionally used tactics reminiscent of the Falcon messengers. During the Siege of Kaffa in 1346, the event often credited with introducing Black Death to Europe, Mongol forces reportedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over city walls. Could this represent a degraded version of the earlier, more sophisticated biological warfare program? The connection is speculative but suggestive. The smallpox virus used in the Falcon messenger attacks was eventually eradicated in the modern era, with the last natural case occurring in 1977. But the strategic logic the Mongols pioneered, using disease as a military tool, survived and evolved. Nations continued developing biological weapons programs well into the 20th century, and concerns about bioterrorism persist today. The Mongols didn't invent biological warfare, but they may have been the first to approach it with systematic scientific methodology. Perhaps most chillingly, the Falcon messenger strategy demonstrates that mass destruction weapons don't require advanced technology. With sufficient understanding of disease transmission and animal training, a pre-industrial society could implement biological warfare that killed thousands. This reality remains relevant in an era concerned about low-technology terrorism and weapons proliferation. The barriers to creating weapons of mass destruction are often more about knowledge and will than technological capability. The story of the Golden Horde's Falcon messengers stands as one of history's most disturbing chapters, a moment when human ingenuity and military necessity combined to create something truly monstrous. The Mongols took humanity's ancient partnership with raptors, a relationship built on mutual respect and cooperation, and perverted it into a delivery system for death. What drives people to cross such boundaries? Was it Batu Khan's ambition, his determination to complete his grandfather's vision of world conquest regardless of cost? Was it the desperate creativity of military planners seeking any advantage against formidable enemies? Or was it something darker, a willingness to view other humans as mere obstacles to be eliminated by whatever means proved effective? These questions have no easy answers. The Mongol commanders who authorized the Falcon messenger program left no personal accounts explaining their reasoning. We can only infer their motivations from the results. Thousands dead, communities destroyed, and a form of warfare that violated every established rule of medieval combat. The Hungarian victims, dying in agony from smallpox delivered by birds they couldn't have anticipated, probably spent their final moments trying to understand what had happened. How could God allow such a thing? Why were they being punished? What sin had they committed to deserve death by pestilence from the sky? Leave your theories in the comments below. What do you think drove the Mongols to develop such a horrifying weapon? Could modern militaries, with all our ethical frameworks and international laws, resist similar innovations if facing existential threats? And perhaps most disturbingly, what other historical biological warfare programs have been lost to time, their details erased or suppressed by those who found them too terrible to document? If this exploration of history's darkest innovations has opened your eyes to how thin the line between civilization and horror can be, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of human history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the events that shaped our world in ways we'd rather forget. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous weapons aren't always the ones we can see. Sometimes they arrive on wings, silent and invisible, carrying death we never imagined possible. See you in the next video.